European Union leaders have agreed to provide €90 billion in financial support to Ukraine, ensuring continued funding for the country's defense against Russia over the next 2 years. The decision was reached after lengthy talks in Brussels and reflects growing urgency within the bloc to prevent Ukraine from running out of money as the war continues, rather than immediately using frozen Russian state assets. EU leaders chose to borrow the funds, with the loan backed by the European Union's shared budget. Officials said this approach avoids legal risks and political divisions that have stalled previous attempts to seize Russian assets. Directly, the announcement was made early Friday morning following hours of negotiations among heads of state and government. EU Summit Chairman Antonio Costa confirmed that the bloc had approved the emergency funding package, describing it as a necessary step to maintain Ukraine's ability to defend itself. According to EU officials, without sustained financial support from Europe, Ukraine could face severe budget shortfalls by the middle of next year, potentially affecting its military operations and economic stability. Since the early months of the war, European governments have frozen large sums of Russian sovereign assets, most of them held in financial institutions. Within the EU, the total value of these frozen funds is estimated at around €210 billion. While some EU leaders and Ukraine itself have pushed for these assets to be used directly to fund Kyiv's defense, the proposal has proven highly controversial. Legal experts have warned that confiscating sovereign assets could violate international law and expose EU countries to retaliation or lengthy court battles. One of the biggest concerns came from Belgium, where the majority of the frozen Russian assets are held. Belgian officials requested strong guarantees to protect the country from potential legal claims or financial consequences if Russia were to challenge the move. After reviewing the risks, EU leaders concluded that the asset-based loan plan was too complex to implement quickly. Instead, they agreed to move forward with a borrowing strategy that would deliver funds to Ukraine without immediate legal uncertainty. Despite shelving the asset plan for now, EU leaders emphasized that the Russian funds will remain frozen indefinitely. Officials stated that the assets would only be released if Moscow agrees to pay war reparations to Ukraine. Under the current framework, if such reparations were ever paid, Ukraine could then use those funds to repay the EU-backed loan. However, leaders acknowledged that this scenario remains uncertain and dependent on future political developments. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz described the agreement as a strategic success, saying it strengthens Ukraine while maintaining European unity. He noted that the decision sends a clear message that Europe remains committed to supporting Kyiv. Reaching agreement was not easy. EU-wide borrowing requires unanimous approval, and several member states had raised objections during earlier discussions. Hungary, whose Prime Minister Viktor Orban has taken a more Russia-friendly stance, had opposed any plan involving Russian asset confiscation. Slovakia and the Czech Republic also expressed concerns about financial exposure. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic agreed to allow the borrowing plan to proceed on the condition that it would not impose financial costs on them directly, EU diplomats described the outcome as a delicate, balancing act that preserved unity while allowing urgent action. One senior diplomat said the deal allowed the bloc to act decisively without forcing reluctant members into participation. The stakes surrounding the decision were high. European officials warned that without fresh funding, Ukraine could struggle to pay soldiers, maintain weapons systems, and keep essential government services running. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said the bloc had little room for failure, stressing that Ukraine's ability to resist Russian aggression depends heavily on sustained international backing. Leaders were also mindful of broader geopolitical messaging. The agreement comes amid increased scrutiny of Europe's role in the conflict, particularly after U.S. President Donald Trump recently criticized European allies as being weak on defense by approving the €90 billion package. EU leaders aim to demonstrate strength, coordination, and long-term commitment Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who attended part of the summit, welcomed the funding decision but continued to urge the EU to move toward full use of Russian assets. Zelensky described the frozen funds as morally justified compensation for the damage caused by Russia's invasion. He argued that using those assets would provide Ukraine with a stable and predictable source of support, while acknowledging the legal concerns. Ukrainian officials said they hope discussions on asset-based financing will continue. The European Commission has been tasked with finalizing the technical details of the loan, including timelines, repayment mechanisms, and budget guarantees. Disbursements are expected to begin as soon as administrative procedures are completed. EU officials stress that the funding is designed to cover both military and economic needs, helping Ukraine stabilize its finances while continuing defensive operations at the same time. Discussions over Russian assets are not over. The Commission will continue examining legal pathways that could allow future use of the frozen funds without exposing member states to excessive risk. The decision marks one of the largest collective financial commitments made by the EU since the start of the war. Analysts say it reflects a shift toward longer-term planning, as leaders acknowledge that the conflict is unlikely to end soon. By choosing borrowing over asset seizure, the EU has opted for a pragmatic solution that prioritizes speed and unity. Supporters argue that this approach ensures Ukraine receives immediate help while keeping diplomatic and legal options open for the future. As the war continues into another year, the €90 billion package underscores Europe's determination to remain a central player in shaping the outcome of the conflict, both on the battlefield and at the negotiating table.